you for joining us. I am Phil Hay Sinclair, the CEO and co-founder here at Drop Bio, and I'm joined here by Georgie Dent, which I'm very excited about. We're going to have a great conversation tonight. So Georgie, thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here and to talk about a whole manner of things that we're going to cover off. And we have people tuning in from all over the country, which is a lot of fun as well. This session is going to be recorded, and so anyone who is registered but can't make it because life has happened, we'll make sure that you get a recording of this so you can dive into all of this conversation. For those of you who are new to Drop Bio and to what we're doing here, we'll get to that and explain a bit about that quickly. We don't want to stand too much in the way of our great conversations about to come up. But if you are new to what we're here to do, every fortnight, our team puts on an event which is not dissimilar to this. Sometimes they happen during the day, most of the time they're in the evenings. And we try and cover a whole range of things that relate to well-being, from all the things you would maybe expect from nutrition to diet and exercise. We dive into fertility, we move into men's health, into mental health, and we also move into a whole range of other items which are really important, including financial well-being. Tonight, we're going to change the script basically all together, and we're going to be talking about a little bit of mental health. We're going to be talking about an amazing book called Breaking Badly, and we're going to jump into some other items that are really close to Georgie's heart as well, including the parenthood. So in the right-hand side of your screen, hopefully, if you're seeing the same screen I'm seeing, you'll be seeing a bunch of messages that are popping up, some links for you to visit and to have a look at, including where you can find Georgie online, and also take a look at her book. You'll also see a link that if you sign up to the wait list for a service I'm about to explain to you, if you're one of the first 5 to do that, we will send you a free copy of Georgie's book, Breaking Badly, because it is something else. I'm going to try not to gush too much about that book because when I read it, I did it in 3 days and it was quite the story, resonated a lot with me across a number of different fronts. Now, very quickly, as far as housekeeping is concerned, we're here to try and keep this to the hour. Georgie has little people arriving home sometime soon. I've got little people as well, and we're trying to get back to them as best we can. But the main game here is to give you some insight which can hopefully improve your outlook on a range of different topics, particularly around perfectionism. And hopefully we'll get to all the questions that you have here tonight. Now, you might see on the right-hand side of your screen, the ability for you to leave questions. Please leave your questions in there and we will get to as many of them as we can. Now, very quickly, Drop Bio. Who is this? What are we all about? And what is the purpose of these kind of events? We are a Sydney-based digital health company and we focus on chronic inflammation. The science that we really get involved with is really trying to understand the body's natural early warning system. And we do that because we can see how, at a really personalized level, we can work on all of these different areas of conditions, but also just general well-being and things like fertility to try and improve people's knowledge, make them feel more empowered and help them take more control about how they're doing a lot of their own health and well-being. We do a lot of things to try and also help convey good evidence-based knowledge and education to people. We have a Facebook group called The Drop In. We have a number of experts, just like Georgie joining us tonight. We have the Wonder League, which is a bunch of fantastic women that help come and review the products and services that we create. We have a number of courses you can do to learn more about things like sleep and inflammation. And we also provide support as part of the products that we provide as well. Now, one of the key things that we have released recently at Drop is a service called Wellbeing by Drop. And the way that we try and deliver really personalized insights is by sending out these really small kits to people's homes. They prick their finger, a little bit of blood comes out, they send it back to us and we take a good look at it. And we turn it into insight that allows you to understand more about how you're doing, not about what a whole bunch of standards tell you out in the world, about how you're doing. And we compare that against the way that you answer a lifestyle questionnaire so that we can help you understand just how broad is the gap between how you're doing biologically compared to what you think is actually going on. We launched this very recently and we launch it again. We do multiple sort of service drops on this in February. And so if you'd like to join the waitlist, like hundreds of other people have as well, you're welcome to do that. Obviously no obligation to do so, but you might get a copy of Georgie's book. So we'd love for you to come and join us on that journey. And we'll be letting you know in late January what you can do more of. And we do our best not to spam you through the process because we know how sacred email inboxes are. So we'd love to share that with you as well. Now, I think there might be one more slide sitting in behind here that we'd like to sort of talk through, and that is how we would love to connect with you. The communities that we've built over the last 18 months have really been designed to give people a safe space to learn and understand what's happening in health and wellbeing. Because I'll be honest, our major competitor here is Mindshare, and that Mindshare goes to places like Goop and other places that can put a whole bunch of really interesting and sometimes quite strange ideas into the world. And what we're here to do is to try and bring you evidence that you can understand, that can just be useful, that you can tactically apply to your day starting from tonight, so that you can live a happy and healthier life. And it's all done so that we can make sure that you are in the best shape that you can be, because we only get one shot at this. So that is my spiel for tonight. And now let's just get to the main event, because I'm super, super excited about this conversation tonight. Georgie is a mother of 3 girls, has gone through the lockdown like many of us have in Australia over the last number of years, has done some extraordinary work in journalism and advocacy, wrote this incredible book, Breaking Badly, and I discovered it through Annabelle Crabb, like most of us discover books these days, through recommendation. We're going to talk about how that all plays out in a second. But Georgie, thanks for spending some time with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight.
Well, we are going to cover off some bits of a very, very interesting and beautiful story. But before we do that, let's sort of start where we are right now, because there is some organizations that you are, fierce supporters of, and one of them is the Parenthood. And I'm just wondering if we can start there and sort of work our way backwards in time, because there's some really interesting things happening at the Parenthood. And if people aren't aware of what this is, it's a 72,000 member organization that does advocacy on behalf of parents and carers. But there's some really interesting stuff coming down the pipe shortly. So could you give us a bit of background about what that actually is? And then we'll get into the broader story in a second.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And just before I jump into that, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. And that, for me, I'm here in my home in Sydney, where I've spent a lot of time this year, unsurprisingly. And I am on Camaragal country. So the Parenthood is, as you said, it's a not-for-profit advocacy organisation. It has been around since 2013. I am the executive director, and I've been in this role since May last year. For the 12 months before that, I had actually been a volunteer on the board of the organisation. And the reason that I had that connection was in my work as a journalist at Women's Agenda and at Mamma Mia, and I had a column in the news, in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age. I have been really focused on policies like paid parental leave and access to high quality early learning and care, particularly around the impact of those policies on women. And because of my journalism in that space, I had a connection with the Parenthood, because they are policies that the Parenthood has sort of been advocating for reform for a really long time. And so when I was invited to join the board, I said absolutely. And then last year, when the opportunity was presented to me to lead the organisation, I said yes, because I just felt, after almost a decade of writing and as a journalist, that I was really ready for a formal advocacy role. And I'm really grateful that with the Parenthood, I have got that. And with a federal election looming, so we know for sure that it has to be held before May next year.
Yep.
It's looking very likely to be either March or May. And the Parenthood, we are gearing up to launch a campaign where we are basically asking as many parents and grandparents and carers as possible to join our campaign called Parents Up, to ask for commitments on expanding paid parental leave and mapping a path towards universal access for early learning and care. And the reason that we are pursuing those two policies is that we commissioned a piece of research earlier this year that looked at what are the policies that give parents the most amount of support and that create positive outcomes for children as well as their parents. And these are two: paid parental leave and access to high quality early learning and care are the two policies that combined literally would transform this country. These are reforms of the sort of Medicare scale that would, and they show, they're proven to show improved health outcomes for both children and parents, improved social outcomes, educational outcomes, economic outcomes. So we think this is an election where parents need to be heard. And that's what we will be doing with our campaign. So if anyone's interested, I'd love for you to jump on the Parenthood on our website, look us up on Facebook or Instagram, on Twitter, and see what we're about. And I can say with a fair amount of confidence that if you are a parent or a grandparent, I think the content that we have and the message that we have will resonate with you.
I can endorse it. Been there before and have signed up. And I guess one of the key things in that conversation, Georgie, I could tell people have just gotten home.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about, just so everyone is clear, because we do hear a lot of conversation about parental leave, and we're going to get to all the other pieces of that in a second. But what is the current state of the nation as it relates to who is the best in class? Who would we look to if we were companies or leaders trying to go, look, who do we try and copy in that versus where it's at? Have you got any sort of thoughts on?
I do, and I'm going to show you here. This is the research report that I just spoke about. And what we asked Equity Economics, which is a female-led economics firm based in Melbourne, to examine what are the best practice policies for families in the world, to identify what those policies are, and then to look around the world and see where Australia ranks in relation to those policies. Now, the research was very clear that paid parental leave, early education and care, health support, and that's physical and mental health support for parents and children during the pregnancy, infants, birth and beyond is critical, and also access to paid carers leave. So they are the sort of four big picture policies that parents need for children to thrive. And the results were really, I've just seen the question pop up. I'm happy to share a link to that report.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll do that in a second. But the results were really compelling that unfortunately Australia really does lag the developed world in the provision of these policies. So when we talk about paid parental leave, in Australia, we have got a scheme for the primary carer, which in itself is quite outdated, for 18 weeks at the minimum wage. And then we have 2 weeks of the minimum wage for dad and partner pay. And that less than half of our biggest employers offer any paid parental leave above the government rate. So the vast majority of families in Australia, what they get is 18 weeks at the minimum wage. Now, in the OECD, the average is 50 weeks of paid leave. And in most cases, what the wage is closer to a replacement wage than to the minimum wage. So America is the only OECD country with a less adequate paid parental leave scheme than we have. And even in America, the individual states that have introduced programs are more generous than what we have. So, and look, it won't surprise you that the countries that have got generous paid parental leave, they do include those clever Nordic countries that we always talk about, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland. But we also, countries like Germany, even in the UK, like they have much more generous schemes than we have. And then again, when it comes to access to early education and care, the same countries, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Finland are right up there. But again, even Canada has got, they're a fair way ahead of us. So it's, there are lots of, one of the things that I'm big on and one of the things we talk about at the Parenthood is life doesn't actually have to be as difficult as we make it for parents in this country. And it's not that parents are expecting a handout or a leg up, but it's really, you need families to be able to provide for their children as well as care for their children. The idea that you can have a baby and then suddenly your financial commitments don't matter, it's ridiculous. Your financial commitments increase when you've got a little person because you need more space for them. You need all of the bits and pieces for it. So but what we do here, and I describe it as parents do not have the roads and bridges that they need to get between home and work. They are asked to build their own. And if you've got a grandparent who lives nearby who can help out, that's going to help you. If you're lucky enough to have an employer who gives you some flexibility, that's going to help you. But until we get those big picture policy settings right, parents are stranded effectively. And there are adverse health ramifications from that for parents as well as children. And as we know, COVID has just exacerbated the sort of the mental load and the psychological distress that parents have experienced.
There is no doubt about that. I think every parent who is sitting on this event right now, and even the replay, will be nodding their head in violent agreement. And so we've put a link for that report into the chat. We'll also make that available on our website, so you can download that there. But obviously, head over to the Parenthood as well to understand more about that. Georgie, I want to jump into and going a little bit back further into time now. The time that just before you found that spark into journalism, there was a precursor to that, which was in writing your book. And the book itself has a number of gems in it. But I just want to read two pieces properly and just give you a comment, because of all of the reading that I went through in it, there were just 2 points that really sort of stood up and noticed. The first one is actually one I read before, and it talked about a comment that you made that Brene Brown had made mention of in Perfectionism. So Brene Brown writes in your book, and as you've noted here, perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be your best. Perfectionism is the belief that we live perfect, look perfect, and act perfect. We can minimize or avoid the pain or blame, judgment, and shame. It's a shield. It's a 20-ton shield we lug around thinking it'll protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's really preventing from enjoying the fun. So you wrote this book after what seemed to be a lifetime of the pursuit of perfection. And I just wanted to go back to the point at which you realized that you should tell this story, because it's quite a profound story. I think many people would sort of get to. So what was the time where you said to yourself, I'm good to write this book, even though I probably feel a little bit petrified about having to somehow materialize all this knowledge and make sense of these incredible kind of experiences?
I'm just conscious that someone said that they can hear that the sound isn't good and that they can hear kids talking in the background, which I'm sorry about, because I'm using my AirPods, which usually means that doesn't happen.
I can hear you well.
Okay, so bear with me. Thank you. And I actually, I will try and make those little people be as quiet as they can be. So I guess my decision to share my story happened gradually. And so I had a nervous breakdown when I was 25. And I had been working as a solicitor in a big law firm. I was a junior. I'd finished 6 years of uni, and I'd sort of landed a job in a big corporate law firm. And I sort of had spent 18 months working, feeling horrendous. So I had chronic illness, and I had a really, really rough time. But at the time I thought everything was normal. But basically I had a nervous breakdown. It was 4 months where I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't walk properly. It was really difficult, and we didn't know what was wrong with me. I had to move back in with my parents. I left Sydney. I was seeing medical specialists galore to try and find out what was wrong with me. And eventually, it was a very long road, but I saw a physician who recommended that I see a psychiatrist and be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. And that was pretty unexpected, but that was the moment that everything changed for me, because I had been searching for an answer, and I was really adamant in my head that there was no rational reason for why I would be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. But then as soon as I went, I spent nearly 3 weeks in this private hospital, and private hospital might make it sound a little bit glamorous, and it wasn't. It was probably the saddest looking building you've ever seen, but it was the best place that I could have gone. And that was, I mean, I describe it as almost like, you know, a mechanic lifting the bonnet of a car. I went there and then really lifted the bonnet of what was going on in my head. I know this is a long way to answer your question, but I'm getting to this point, that I was a person up until that point, so 4 months before I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, when I was dealing with really serious, legitimate chronic illness. On the occasions where I had to go to hospital and therefore was not able to go to work because of the issues I was having with Crohn's disease, I would feel invariably worse about having to call work and say, I can't come into work, than I felt about the fact that here I was being admitted to hospital again with a flare-up that we couldn't get under control. So and I'm giving you that context because I was someone who was very conscious of keeping up appearances, and I didn't want to be the person who was always sick and who wasn't reliable. And so I did everything I could to try and protect that. And what changed for me was when I went to rehab, and I lifted the lid on the bonnet, and I sort of, you know, I mean, when you're in rehab, I was seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist every day. There were multiple sessions, there was group therapy, there were workshops. And it sort of, all of these things became so clear to me. And I had spent most of my life thinking that I was really deficient and that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. And largely that stemmed from because I did have these health issues, and I really had internalized that as being some sort of like fundamental deficiency. But I suddenly realized that, you know, I had an actual chronic illness, and I had to live with that. And actually, if anything, I really left rehab with an understanding that actually I'd spent my whole life thinking that I was so weak and that I wasn't as good as other people. And I left not thinking that I was better than anyone else, but I left knowing that what I had been hiding was really rough. And if I could get through that, I was actually quite resilient. And I learned all these things there that I had never heard before. And so when I left rehab, I was actually really honest about it to people. So even the law firm, when I called to resign, which was inevitable, not because a law firm gave me the catalyst for having a nervous breakdown, but because in that sort of environment, I just knew I was not going to be able to prioritize my health, physical and mental, in the way I needed to leave rehab and actually regain full health. So I resigned. And when I resigned, I said to my boss, I've been in a psychiatric hospital and I have been diagnosed with, you know, a generalized anxiety disorder, and this has gone on and this has gone on. And I didn't feel ashamed. I didn't feel any of that shame that I felt when I was calling to say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I can't come in, I'm back in hospital. And what I noticed was when I told people what happened, they were always, like, the response was always so positive. And then it was about 2 years later that my husband and I were living overseas, and I didn't have a job and I was bored, and I wrote about what had happened to me, and I sent it off to, I was working as a journalist by this stage, but I sent it off anonymously to what is now Mamma Mia, the enormous website, but back then was literally just a website that was Mia Friedman and there was no one else. And they published the piece, and I was brutally honest, and I felt so vulnerable, even though my name wasn't attached to it. And even though I was, you know, in the UK on the other side of the world, and this was being published on a website in Australia, it felt so vulnerable. But within 24 hours, there were 100 comments, and everyone's comments were virtually, you know, they were either incredibly supportive, but more of them were saying, oh my goodness, this happened to me, or this is, you know, you've just described what my sister is going through, or my niece or my granddaughter. And so that was 2 years after the event. And then it was about another 2 or 3 years after that I then put my name to that piece. And then I started speaking at events about my experience. And every time I did, the response was the same as it was to that first piece, that so many people can relate to the experience that I had. The details are different inevitably, but it is almost universal. And that is the one thing. Anyway, so that is basically why because I have been a writer and I was approached by a publisher about writing a book, and they asked me what I would like to write about. And I said, look, I do think that if I'm going to write a book, the book I have to write is my experience. And so that's how it came to be.
And I mean, this is a 3-part, so for people who haven't read it, this is a 3-part book. It sort of goes through very discrete chapters, and some of those chapters in life they seem to go for a long time in life. And when you get to the end of the first act, as it were, you're left thinking, this is a really long time to feel unwell, and to sort of feel as though you've got to pull yourself through the mud for such an enormously long amount of time. When people started to talk to you and give you that reflection that, I think I'm living this, I think this is my life, or it's someone that I know, what do you suggest to them to be the first thing they can do? Because I imagine you'd be hit up by a number of people just looking for a gentle nudge or a tip or something that they can do to get that back under control. How do you respond to that? Because you're right, the details will be different, but the feeling, like that visceral kind of, wait a second, that's me. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I say is sorry, I've just seen another comment about the background noise. I'm really sorry. One of the things that I say to people is, if you have got this inkling in the back of your mind that life is harder more often than it's easy, that is a really solid indication that it might be worth pausing and just taking a look at what is going on. Because for a really long time, I had this sense that I can't do this. This is so hard. Like on a daily basis, it was so difficult, but I didn't kind of stop and pay attention to that. I just kept going. And I think that, my book does, because it starts when, I write about it, really, it starts from when I'm 19. And I was really unwell for a really long time. But I don't think that I didn't just have a nervous breakdown because of my chronic illness. There were so many factors at play. And what I say is, if that's sort of my general litmus test, like if life is feeling more difficult more often than it's feeling manageable, then it's probably a really good time to step back and look at what's going on. And I know that that's terrifying. I just know that it is. I know that it makes you very vulnerable to even have that conversation with yourself, let alone then do something about it. But what I also say to a lot of people is that asking for help is no doubt scary, but not asking for help and living without the help that you need is harder. I know that.
There is no doubt about that. And the idea of it being multifactorial is not uncommon. Trying to sort of pinpoint the single thing that is going on can be really, really difficult to work through. Page 149 of your book, this is where it sort of changed here for me when I was reading it. And it was specific around where it seemed as though the identification of perfectionism as a thing was the structure that helped sort of, the light went on in your mind around, okay, this is what I think is the problem. And there's a whole bunch of gnarly things coming off the back of that. But you wrote this, and this was in response to, I think, some of the support you had from somebody called Victoria, who I imagine was one of the psychs or one of the psychiatrists. So she says, well, you've noted that perfectionism was my paradigm. One of the reasons perfectionism is toxic is because ultimately it's about seeking approval from others, Victoria said. It's about measuring up. But perfectionists rarely concede that they do measure up. And so it was at that point where it became very clear that the penny's dropped. So how do you sort of deconstruct that? I guess my question, Georgie, is, you had some great help trying to unravel that, to make sense of it so that you can reorient towards the problem and sort of work out what to do. When people may not have the courage to go and seek that help, might not actually know where to start, is this a conversation first and foremost with the GP to open the door to a set of conversations where you can actually seek specialist help, or is there another mechanism that you think people could be playing with before they go and have a formal conversation about this?
And I would say that in my book, there's a couple of different themes that I talk about. And, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. I was put on medication that I have stayed on. And so for me, there was absolutely a medical component to part of what was happening.
Yep.
There was no doubt about that. But it also wasn't sort of just as simple as, and everyone will say this, that with any mental illness, as with any health condition, really, there's never going to be just one way of treating that or one approach. So, but absolutely for me, there was a medical component to what was happening. And I think that if you are feeling like there is a medical component to what you're experiencing, and by medical, I mean if you've got the physiological kind of symptoms. Like I lived my whole life as a shallow breather. I thought that was normal. I had heart palpitations all the time. I lived in a really constant, heightened state of stress, and I did not know that there was another way to be. Like I genuinely didn't. If you have got the sort of physiological things happening where you are feeling like your heart is racing, you've got, and not just in a moment where you've got something nerve-wracking that you've got to do, where it's normal to have that sort of heightened physiological response. But if that's something that you're experiencing a lot, or if you are feeling really flat, if any of those, and obviously go to resources. So Beyond Blue, any of those, they've always got amazing checklists. And if you look at those checklists and you are ticking a lot of boxes, absolutely, I would say a conversation with your GP is a wonderful place to start. But if you're not feeling quite ready for that, I think one of the things that exists now that didn't exist when I had my nervous breakdown was podcasts. You didn't have this sort of audio content. And I think that one of the things that I feel now is, and I do at times go back and see a psychologist and sort of when things are tricky, I don't just have a standing appointment with a psychologist, but I go back and see them when I need to. But even when it's not at the point where I think I need to go and see someone, if I'm feeling a bit funny or off, I look up podcasts and I think, I wonder what Brené Brown would say about this, or there is a lot out there, and I think that can be a much sort of gentler journey than booking the appointment with the GP and saying, okay, I think I've got, I think I might have a medical condition right now. Does that answer the question? Like, I think seeking out information is because also when my book came out, one of the things, and this still happens, and it actually breaks my heart, is that when my book first came out, I was getting multiple messages every single week on different mediums from people who'd read my book, and people who even came to events that I did. Back when I launched this book, like real life events were a thing. Remember that?
I do. I think. Yeah.
And, I would be at events and people would come up to me and say, this is me right now. I know I've got my doctor has said I've got to be admitted to a facility, but I can't. I'm just not up to it yet. I really wanted to see you. But basically every inbox I have I just got floods of emails from people saying that they are in this tricky spot right now. And now I don't get, I'm not getting 15 emails every week, but I'm getting multiple messages a month from someone who's going through this. And what I always reflect on, and this is the bit that makes me sad, is it's invisible. So I know how many people are having genuinely really, really difficult times, but you don't see it. And there's a reason for that, because you can't, when you're in the middle of feeling how terrible you're feeling, you can't share that publicly. well, I mean, some people might, but it would be very rare. It's not the kind of thing that you can just say to someone. And so we don't
Yeah.
see it. And therefore, it's really easy to think that there is no one else going through what you're doing, what you're going through. And so that's also why I do think things like books and podcasts and seeking out information is really good, because you are not alone. Like, whoever, if you are having a rough time right now, I promise you there is someone else having the, and it's not about one-upmanship. It's not about who's having the worst time, but it's about the fact that you're not alone in having a bad time.
That's it. And it's interesting as well, because the language that is often not available to people. So trying to make some kind of sense of what's going on. We look to the like today's luminaries, right? Which are the Brené Browns, who have done 20 years of research to formulate the language to enable the conversation. We have those, but closer to home, we have people like Professor Ian Hickey, who has his Minding Your Mind sort of podcast, which I've been deeply surprised about how informative that is, sort of using a little bit of humor and just sort of his unique communication style to sort of break apart a whole manner of mental health and mental goodness that you can do by some really interesting tips. So I couldn't agree more. You mentioned in the book Nick, your husband, who has been essentially through this with you just about all of the way. And so you also mentioned some of our previous exchanges, how as a sort of a co-captain in the household, he plays an essential role. While this was going on, he was playing very sort of top tier rugby. He was doing a lot of things. He was studying a lot as well. And it seemed like he was just the ultimate sounding board support source. How would you suggest that people can talk to their partners about this? Because as most of us know, the way that mental health tends to evolve, it doesn't tend to sort of just appear. There are some conditions where it is very acute, and it can come on very, very quickly. But there can be an element, I suppose, of shame. There can be an element of, as you've described, I don't want to let people down. But your partner is the key person. They're with you for a reason, but it might be really difficult to broach that topic with them. It seems that you had a long time and, the perfect partner to have that conversation with. But when we talk about that exchange between partners, how should people maybe think about that so that they can have someone to share the load with? Because it's an enormous load to bear by yourself.
And I think that one of the, so I mean, my husband Nick, he was my boyfriend at the time. We did meet quite young, so we were 22 when we met, and so we had done a sort of period of our life before we got into full-time work, and we had moved in together 6 months before I ended up having to move back home with my parents. And in those 6 months, and I mean, even in the year before that, when I first, the first year in the law firm, even though we weren't living together, we were spending a lot of time together. And so Nick, in a way that no one else saw, he saw physically what my body was doing to me. And because, as I said, I have mentioned Crohn's disease. It's a gastrointestinal autoimmune condition. It's not nice at all. And it isn't something that it wasn't necessarily something that he and I talked about all the time, but because he was a medical student and he's a doctor now, but he wasn't back then, I think he had a sort of I don't know, he sort of was aware of the medical condition itself, and also we were spending so much time together that he sort of saw the toll that my body was taking on me in a way that other people wouldn't have, because I was always really good at sort of putting on a brave face. I mean, if you were, you could look at me and I didn't look like a picture of absolute health, but you would not, the people I worked with would have had no idea the full extent of what I was battling. And I think that probably that is one of the things that meant, because I mean, to be fair, Nick and my mum had both, and sort of really gently tried to suggest to me that anxiety might be an issue, and I was not interested in hearing that message from them at all. Even though they have always had my back and loved me really unconditionally. I wasn't ready for them to tell me that. because and that's what I say before about that conversation about, like, I wish it was as easy as just saying go to the GP or talk to your partner, because
Yes.
those things are so much easier said than done. And I think one of the other things that has been, I guess I didn't expect it from my book, was that a lot of people have said it's helped them with someone in their life that's had anxiety, because if your partner has got it or your daughter has it and you don't have it, it can be quite, you know, it's just a different world. It's a different paradigm. And so
Yes.
I think that it's really difficult to expect. And I would say that, like, Nick is and was an incredible partner, but I think in some ways we benefited from not having, because we'd been together for a period of time and he'd seen it, we didn't have to have a kind of, I'm going to sit you down and tell you that I'm not coping, because it was really
Yeah.
clear to both of us. And he was, I think, really good at sort of being supportive without being like, also we were so young then, and he was studying and he was, he was doing a lot of things. But I do think that it's really difficult for the teller and the tellee, like, whether it's your best friend or whether it is your partner, it is really difficult to sit down and tell them exactly how you're feeling, because it is the definition of vulnerability. Like, you are putting yourself out there. And so I think that that's not a reason not to do it, but it's also a reason to sort of think about how you want to do it, and to also be gentle with the person you're telling, because they are very likely to want to immediately go in and make everything better, and it might make them defensive. They may think that somehow it's a reflection on them, and these conversations can be loaded, and it's not because the partner is doing the wrong thing. I think that it's, I mean, I guess that's a bit of a long-winded answer there, but I think you can't expect somebody else to have all of the knowledge that you have.
Yes, of course. Of course. I think there was actually a point that Melody was making in the chat here about trying to make sure that someone doesn't somehow think it's their fault for what's gone on. They're just trying to receive and compute the information that was coming to them.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that comment there from Melody is interesting, because I think there absolutely is an inclination to sort of blame yourself. I did this. As I said, when I got to rehab and I really kind of had a bit of a paradigm shift, I did internalize the fact that I was sick as like a personal failing, and therefore having a mental health condition is just like another component of that. So, and if you are in the sort of perfectionist mindset, that it's just another tool to beat yourself up with, like it is.
Yes.
And that, I think, is probably the hardest thing, is being compassionate towards yourself, and recognizing that it's not your fault. You're doing the best that you can.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's two questions, one that's come from Stephanie, another one's come prior to tonight. So where is the line between goal-oriented and being driven, and perfectionism and overstretching yourself? Because my sense is that it's probably a pretty gray area that can sort of expand and contract given any other kind of day. How do you sort of try and make that distinction between those two states?
Yeah. So one of the benefits I had of having sort of such an extreme experience, where I was so acutely unwell and unable really to participate in life, was that I had, and I say this in the book, like, if rock bottom has anything going for it, it is the clarity that you find in the dark. And what I would say is, you've got to step back and think, like, what is the whole point of living? And part of the point of living is enjoying yourself. It is enjoying being a human being. It is enjoying being able to go for a swim, or having dinner with your friends, or going, having a partner, enjoying your children. Like, we are not robots, and we do not live in a report card where we need to get A+, 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 A+. So for me, the line is, if my desire to do well and to be perfect, like to be goal oriented and driven and do everything amazingly well, if that is impeding the quality of my life, then that's usually where I'm overstepping the mark. And
Yeah.
I think that you have to trust your instinct there, because it feels good when you're doing things well. And that's
Yes.
there's part of that that's good. And I mean, I have a career that I love, and I enjoy doing, like, I enjoy when I perform well. But it's sort of taking that step back and looking at the whole picture. And it's like, okay, did performing well, did that cost me? Like, did I not exercise, or did I not see my friends, or did I not do all of those other things that make up the full picture of my life? And yeah, maybe you might have to do that if it's for a massive project or whatever. But again, if that's more often than not, then I think that's when you're getting into trouble, because it's sort of like you've got to
Yeah.
be able to put your goals and your drive into perspective. And the perspective that I got in rehab was that I had a period of time where I literally couldn't be involved in going to be able to, because I mean, yeah, I go into it in the book, but I had this vertigo. I was dizzy. I felt nauseous all the time. I couldn't look after myself. Like, I couldn't drive. And I was 25 and I had, in my head 3 minutes ago, I'd been, working as a lawyer in the city, living with my lovely boyfriend.
Yeah.
And I think because I had all of that kind of taken away for a long enough period, like 4 months isn't, obviously it's not 3 years, but it's not nothing. And for 4 months when you're living like that, I really did genuinely think I'm not going to be able to do fun things ever again in my life. And I really did have that sense that if I get a shot at life again, I want to make sure I'm enjoying it. I don't want to spend my whole time pleasing people that I don't even really know why I'm trying to please so desperately.
Yeah, this is one of the cruxes of the questions we get often in this sort of area as well. I mean, we'll get to one of the questions in a second, but I think there is something about being able to understand what actually does make you happy. I think in one of the exchanges we had leading up to tonight, one of the key messages for me was you want to live a life you're not running away from, right? You want to live a life that you can actually sit down and enjoy for what it is right now, because it could change tomorrow, it could change in a week. But for now, yeah, stretch yourself. Yes, enjoy what you can at life, but don't be trying to run away from it where you can. And sometimes that is so much easier said than done for a whole range of environmental circumstances that we've seen really play out in COVID. I think one of the most fascinating statistics that I saw was just the startling rates of domestic violence that started to sort of pop up throughout the period, because for those of us living with lovely partners and our kids, yes, we were battling a certain level of fatigue and everything else, but it was nothing compared to what people were battling where they had no way to really get out of relationships and things became really, really difficult. So I think there's a huge amount of perspective that can come from that. The questions are starting to fill up in the chat menu quicker than we can probably get to them. But before we do, Georgie, when you think about the last 2 years of what has been an extraordinary time. We've got kids that are roughly the same age. Our 6-year-olds, this has been a third of their life sort of experiencing COVID, which is sort of a bit mind-blowing when you think about all the things that have gone on in the world in our lives today, notwithstanding our personal experiences. We talked really briefly before about how we help our children make sense of all of these things, and of course they're byproducts of our genetics. They will carry forward with them a whole range of different likes and dislikes and behaviors and traits that we couldn't even begin to see until we see it in their own faces. When we think about all of the standards that we're creating for our children, whether it's inadvertent or accidental or intended, how do you think, as just an open question, because I really don't have the answer to this, how do we help our children understand that having a sense of humor is a good thing? You're not actually going to hit the bar every time, and by the way, you're not supposed to. And in life, this is going to happen a lot, and it's completely cool for that to be the case. What sort of language do you use, if it's not too personal a question, with your kids to sort of just help them realize that, what, if you fall down, it's going to be fine. And the key measure I have of this is when a GP looks at, kids at different stages in their life, when they have a check-in at 3 years, and then again at 5 years, and then at 6 years, and they look for the number of bruises on their legs, and they look at it to see if they're actually falling down and hurting themselves, because that's part of growing up, and it's a fascinating measure of general practice. that they do that, because you go, why are you looking at my kids' legs? Well, it's just because they're going to trip over. And if they are, it means they're active and they're outside and they're exploring, and that's a good thing to do in life. But how do we do that with our children? Like, what is the way to kind of approach that on a day-by-day basis with all the life they're leading and that's coming into their minds?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a lot in it, and I would say that it is an area where it is a constant work in progress. But one of the
Sure.
things that I have sort of come to understand is that it's really easy for parents living in this moment right now, like parents of sort of, primary school age children. We have sort of been indoctrinated that our prime role is to make our kids happy all the time. And
Yeah.
the reality is, and there are a lot of great people on Instagram who I follow now around this sort of thing and parenting. And I mean, Brené Brown again on parenting is really good. But and
Yep.
a friend of mine who's also a parent educator, Jen Muir, who runs an organization called Connected Parenting. She has great resources. And the message that I am really taking on board is that as parents, our job is not just to make kids feel happy. It's to let our kids know that there are a range of emotions and it is okay to feel all of them. And
Mm-hmm.
that is something that is deeply uncomfortable because,
Yeah.
we don't want that. We want kids to be happy. But if we spend our whole lives doing that, we are setting them up and ourselves up for perfectionism, because it's not possible. It's not. No one is going to feel happy all the time. There's going to be disappointment. We are going to be hurt. We're going to be angry. We'll be jealous, and trying to let your kids, give them full permission to feel those things, even when it means, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry that's how you're feeling right now. I can't make this better, but you acknowledge the feelings because the feelings are valid.
Yep.
But I find that really helps me in trying to kind of navigate that terrain. And then the other thing is, I mean, I'm really conscious now of the language that I use. And I've had, when you make a mistake at work or when you have a setback, and I'm really honest about it. And the kids have, and I think that that's good because they have seen things like they've come to my book launch and they know that I've had some great work things happen, but they've also seen me
Yep.
in weeks where things are going badly. And it is that thing of like, I've got to put this into perspective. It is a really disappointing situation. It's made me angry or it's made me upset or I'm feeling, let down, but you keep going. And it's also one of the my husband, who's obviously in the book, he has been doing specialty medical training, and he literally just last week passed his final ever exams. And
Oh, that's epic.
thank
Congratulations.
you. Like it's been a huge process. But again, because of that, the kids have seen that he's had setbacks. Like he's had exams that he hasn't passed. And when I say he hasn't passed, he's got 79% and you need 81% to pass.
Yep.
We're not talking about, total failure, but they have seen that as well, which I think is kind of useful in a way. So I think what I'm saying is like, be honest with the kids about the bad things as well as the good things, so that you're setting them up with realistic expectations that you are going to get bruised and there will be rewards and joy. And yeah.
It's funny, and there's a question I'd love to get to for Melody as well, the link between toxic perfectionism and the underachievement, chronic procrastination, because there is a vortex that can be created there around, one thing leads to another, and you can get stuck. Before we get to that, I love your thoughts on that answer. I was a soldier as my first job out of school, and so as a military guy, there was one guy who we all looked up to very much, and he didn't say a lot. But he did have a favorite word, and that word was good. And whenever something went well, it was good. Not fantastic, not you're amazing, just good. And whenever something went wrong, he would look at you with a look and also say good. And it was the suggestion basically said, you've just learned something. And he would help you understand what the lesson was if you were sort of struggling with it, although most of the time it's quite obvious. And there's a real element to that, even at Drop and other interests that we all have in different parts of the world. People can feel very disappointed. They can feel like they don't meet the grade. And there's a comment in the comment section here. that really talks to that. I feel as though the best leaders help you recognize that if you didn't fail at something, there was no chance we would never have learned that that was something that we now know.
Mm.
And if we recognize it and now we won't do that again, I think there's an old Chinese proverb that says, don't let the spear hit you twice. And, you can be hit once, no problem. You'll learn from it. If you get hit a second time, it's kind of, we did learn that once before. And I think if people just are good at recognizing that, it becomes so much easier to deal with the disappointment that you've invested so much into something, but you feel like you felt short. There's a really good chance the world doesn't see it that way, which I think is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I also think that one of the other things that we haven't really talked about as much, but it's very relevant with the line between sort of toxic perfectionism and optimalism, where you're trying hard, and it is really having a sense of self-worth that is not dependent upon external validation, because that is the thing that will, and I would sort of say that's kind of like it's like an insurance policy, because at the end of the day, even if you make the biggest mistake in the world that you could make in your job, you are still worthy. You are still a human being who is deserving of love, and from yourself more than anyone.
Yes.
But when you don't have that, and I certainly didn't have that, and that's why when I was constantly like, oh my God, I have to do more, I have to try hard, what if I don't do this? It was coming from a toxic place of, if I don't do this, I am not good enough. Whereas, and again, it's hard to do, and it's a work in progress. Like there's no, it's not a quick fix, but you have to sort of really be honest with yourself about, I am enough, even just as I am. And I found this in lockdown, particularly, as you and I briefly spoke about, with kids here and a husband who wasn't able to work from home because he's in hospitals. I had to just be okay with the fact that my productivity would not be what it normally is. And that was a real process of saying to myself, I mean, I had to obviously work through, work commitments still, but it was really that thing of, even if I don't do anything externally important today, I matter. Yep. I'm a mum of two, I'm a mum of 3 kids. I've got all these other things, but it really is kind of that pep talk, and you have to believe it, and I mean, I used to think this stuff was all just, I thought it didn't matter. And then look who fell into rehab. So it does matter. And
it matters a lot.
Yeah.
It does. Georgie, we're coming to time, and I could talk to you about this for the next 12 hours comfortably. But I just wanted to thank you on behalf of all of the team here for spending some time to sort of talk through these things. The book is Breaking Badly. The work that you do at the Parenthood is extraordinary. And if you want to follow what Georgie is up to, and in particular the advocacy that she's trying to bring to light and does every day, you'll see that on Twitter, you'll see that on her socials, the Parenthood, and all the other channels that she's part of. Please do check it out, and we'll have all the links on our website for what was happening here. But Georgie, it's been awesome catching up with you. It's a great pleasure.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. And I hope the background noise hasn't been too distracting. It is always, I mean, I've done so many online events now, as we all have over the last 2 years. But yeah, and thank you so much for having me and for coming along. And also, thank you. I know that you made a donation on my behalf to the women's community shelters, which they do phenomenal work. So yeah, thank you for doing that.
You bet. Well, everyone, have a good evening. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully you'll join us for our next event, which is not too far away. You can see all the details at dropbio.com/events, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.